The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, the founder of Orange Shirt Day joins us for a conversation on residential schools and reconciliation. Later, J.N. Jagannathan speaks to one of the three commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's all next on The Agenda. September 30th, known as Orange Shirt Day, is meant to recognize the painful legacy of Canada's residential school system. Phyllis Webstad, the founder of Orange Shirt Day and author of a new children's book called Today is Orange Shirt Day, she joins us now to explain how she turned that painful legacy into a powerful tool for reconciliation. And I want to thank you for coming all the way from British Columbia to be with us here tonight. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I would like you to take us back a long time, more than 50 years. You're, I guess, a child of 5 or 6 years old, and your grandmother brought you a shiny new orange shirt. What's the story there?
Yeah. I'm third generation Indian residential school survivor. So what that means is Granny was the first generation. She went from 1925 to 1935. All of her 10 children went as well. It was law. She didn't have a choice in that, including my mother from 1954 to 1964. And Granny's eldest grandchild also went. I'm Granny's second eldest. So when I turned 6, she did what she had always done. She got me ready. We went to town with my cousin and I don't remember what my cousin bought, but I chose a shiny orange shirt. It was the early 70s, 1973, the crazy, hippie, psychedelic, wild colors, and I chose a shiny orange shirt. It had a collar and 3 buttonholes with the shoelace string in front, and it was bright and exciting, just like how I felt to be going to school for the first time. I just turned 6 in July, and this would have been like end August, beginning of September. And when I got to the mission, as we call it, the St. Joseph Mission Indian Residential School, about 20 minutes out of Williams Lake, or a 2-hour bus ride from my reserve.
It's in British Columbia.
Yeah, and when I got there, my my clothes, including my shirt, was taken, and I never did wear it again. I don't have a memory of receiving it back.
That incident obviously stayed with you and was hugely significant over the intervening years. How did you take that and turn that incident into Orange Shirt Day?
Well, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as we know, was winding up. Their final report was in 2015. In early 2013, I was not working. I didn't have a boss of me, so I could do what I wanted. And I heard that the TRC was coming to Williams Lake, and they were having a truth-telling for survivors, and we put up a couple of monuments. But I went to the meetings, and we had 2 media events because we wanted to invite, well, Indigenous, obviously, but the ranchers, the school district, the non-Indigenous, like RCMP. We wanted them to know they were welcome to hear the truths of survivors, and I was chosen as the survivor to attend the media event, and that's how I told my orange shirt story for the first time.
We should probably at this moment try to make a distinction between Orange Shirt Day, September 30th, and Truth and Reconciliation Day, September 30th.
Yes.
2 different things, same day. What do we need to know about the distinction?
The National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is the implementation of TRC's recommendation number 80. So what that is to have a day of recognition and remembrance for survivors and their families, their communities, and those that never made it home. and which is what Orange Shirt Day is about as well. So that's why the government chose September 30th as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It did not replace Orange Shirt Day, it is both. And so I ask everyone when they reference one to please reference the other, that it's both, and I don't want Orange Shirt Day to be forgotten about, and in my eyes, it wasn't replaced with the National Day.
So two different things, same day, a good day to recognize the importance of both. Mm-hmm. Your grandmother attended residential school. Your mother attended a residential school. You attended a residential school. Have the three generations, or did the three generations ever have a chance to sit down together and compare notes?
I have a book out called Beyond the Orange Shirt Story, and it's the 6th-generational family story, and all of my books been inspired by elementary and high school, so this is geared towards high school students. And my aunt also has a book that raised me. I lived with my grandmother until I was 10, and my mother was so traumatized by her 10-year experience that she could not look after me. So I lived with my aunt. My aunt has a book of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. She's editor of that, Agnes Jack. It's called Behind Closed Doors, and her, myself, and my grandmother, because she was writing this book, were having conversation about residential school, but otherwise it's not something we talk about at the Thanksgiving table or the Christmas table.
No, a difficult conversation to be sure. Let's do. Can I show some of the book here?
Sure.
Okay, because today is Orange Shirt Day, is your book, and it's first of all, it's a beautiful book. It is tactile. It has a simple but clear message. Let's just show this here. That's your grandmother.
Yes.
That is the grandmother of whom we were just speaking.
Yes.
Okay. Sheldon, if you want, come out to a wide shot here, because I'm going to find something else here. Who's this guy in the back of the book?
That's my 8-year-old grandson, Adam. Yeah.
All right. Has Grandma had a chance to talk with grandchildren about her experiences? Yes.
They've been learning about it in school, and we have a cultural fishing camp on the river. We didn't this year on the Fraser River, but we look forward to that, and that's the time for storytelling and to be talking about it. Plus, my other members of my family also talk a bit about their stories. But the inspiration for that picture was my grandson Adam last year. He said, "Right, Grandma? Every child matters, including me."
And there you go. That's the including me. He's pointing to himself with the thumb. There we go.
You,
It's always hard to know at what age you can begin to discuss with children tragic things. You don't want to do it too young out of fear of traumatizing them, but you don't want to leave it too late either. This book, Today is Orange Shirt Day, is aimed, you tell us, at those who are 3 years old and younger.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's the age at which it's okay to begin to understand this?
At that age, it's just the vocabulary and becoming familiar, I guess, with the image, maybe of the orange shirt, and residential school history is not only Indigenous history, it's Canadian history. And so I feel it's an appropriate age to just start that conversation. And my book, The Orange Shirt Story, is more for kindergarten age, and there's curriculum that goes with that as well. And at that age, all they understand is a wrong was done. My shirt was taken, and they can't imagine losing a piece of clothing that was bought for them for school and not somebody taking it away. That's just not right. And from there, the awareness increases.
Phyllis, I'm wondering if part of your target audience here isn't just the 3-year-olds who are having this book read to them, but the parents who are reading the book to their 3-year-olds. What do you think?
Yes, I believe children are teaching their parents most definitely, and I find that when I'm at the airport, for instance, it's the school-age children and the teachers that recognize me. If a person doesn't recognize me, it usually means they're a bit younger and they don't have children. Yeah.
When you are talking to people this young about subjects that are this problematic, what are the important things you have to take into account in having that conversation?
Yeah, my presentations, they're so different from the adult who gets like the full meal deal kind of thing, and the younger ones, it's a lot about entertaining them. One of the questions I ask is, who's had a sleepover? You know, aren't sleepovers fun? And so then I tell them, I'm going to tell you a story about when I had a sleepover for 300 sleeps. And some of them, they're, wow, you know, they can't. And just other questions like that to engage them, like who's 5, who's 6, because that was the age of my cousin and I. 5 and 6-year-olds should not be comforting each other, but that was the case. We didn't have adults to console us, and that's where Every Child Matters comes from, is yeah, we could be sick, tired, lonely, hungry, and we weren't tended to.
Let's just understand this as well from your family's point of view. Your grandmother, your mother, you, all residential schools.
And also my son.
And your son.
Yeah, went for 3 months at the St. Michael's when it closed in 1996.
And where's that?
In Saskatchewan.
In Saskatchewan. Mm-hmm. So this kid here, mm-hmm. This kid and does he have siblings?
Yes, there's 5 of my grandchildren, yeah.
And they would be the first generation in your family not to attend residential schools?
Yes, and they are the first in 5 generations to be raised by their mother and their father because of residential school. So Granny, Mom, me, and my son didn't have that.
In light of all of your efforts to put this on our agenda, what hopes do you have for your grandchildren's lives that clearly was beyond what you could hope for?
Yeah, that might get me a bit emotional here, but for them, I want them to be able to live in a world, a society that and not have these same experiences that I did with racism and the ignorance of our history. And also in our own homes, not having this topic talked about and understood, and the impacts of residential school on our families and on our communities and on this country. So they're learning this in school as well as home right now. And I'm 57. It wasn't talked about in my home. I felt like I was crazy most of the time as a teenager, because it's like that elephant in the room. I'm living the effects, but it's not talked about, and I don't know how it's affecting me, but I just feel crazy. And but I didn't have the words for it. And so and I can even notice it now with them being raised by their mother and their father. Like they, as Murray Sinclair said, they're growing up to be who they were meant to be. We didn't have that opportunity to be who we were meant to be. Granny was sent away, my mom was sent away, and didn't have that parenting or the language and the culture. And so it's a rebuilding and repair job, you know, in so many ways.
Let me just ask you finally, Orange Shirt Day the first time was 2013, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. How much progress do you think we've made on reconciliation in the intervening years?
Yeah, truth comes before reconciliation, and the truth is not yet fully told. And in 2026, I plan to make a big deal out of the graduating class across Canada in Williams Lake as well as other places, because they are the first to have residential school Orange Shirt Day teachings, 2013 plus kindergarten and 12 years, so 2013 plus 13.
They will be the graduate and the first grads.
Yes, and I've noticed it already, and one of the big things is just being treated as a human being. That is such a breath of fresh air, to be looked at as a human being and a person, and because that wasn't always the case for my grandmother. My mom, they weren't even allowed in non-Indigenous restaurants. That's why we like Chinese food so much. The Chinese had the same history, and they allowed our people into their restaurants.
So that was 11 years ago. Do you think about where we're all going to be in our relationship 11 years from now?
I get asked that quite a bit, and I couldn't even have thought that it would be what it is today. So in another 10 years, I look forward to there being more education for our Indigenous people. I look forward to less trauma, and instead of all of the heartache that we live with as Indigenous people on a daily basis, we have a whole generation dying right now from drugs in Canada. Because you can't heal what you don't talk about, and we need to start talking about the truth of what happened. And if I could put a plug in, there's a documentary called Sugarcane, and it's a reserve outside of Williams Lake, the Williams Lake First Nation. They have a documentary on the residential school that 3 generations of my family attended. It talks about the truth that's not yet fully told, and it's horrific. And yeah.
The education continues.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you for making the trip from British Columbia to visit us here today. I am happy to recommend, for those of you who've got kids or grandkids of the age, today is Orange Shirt Day, which it is, September 30th.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, for visiting us here. We're so grateful.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Years after Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission handed down their 94 calls to action, what progress has been made? Marie Wilson reflects on her role on the commission and how far Canada has come in her new book, North of Nowhere, Song of a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner. And Marie Wilson joins us now in studio. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
All right. I want to start off by reading a passage from your book about what the commission set out to do. It reads, "We set out to research and document the complete history of more than a century of so-called Indian residential schools, to educate the general public about the true history of this country, and to inspire ongoing reconciliation between and among Indigenous peoples and all Canadians. In other words, our job was to dig up almost 150 years of scattered, hidden history to find ways to drill it into the heads and hearts of people who generally knew nothing about it, and to convince everyone along the way that things could and should be different from now on. More honest, more respectful, more inclusive, more loving, more Canadian." Now, Marie, you were one of 3 commissioners alongside Justice Mary Sinclair and Chief Wilton Littlechild. Given this challenging undertaking, people probably might be surprised to learn that this is not an appointed role. You applied for this. Why?
Well, the issue I already knew about. You know, I was a journalist for most of my professional career, and I had worked and lived and reported in a part of Canada that had the highest per capita number of residential school survivors of anywhere in the country. Even though people were not talking about it a lot at that time, you could see all around you the struggles and some of the challenges that flowed from how people felt about each other and how they felt about themselves. I grew up in a family home where my husband himself was a residential school survivor, and I was raised in one of the Christian churches that ran residential schools, even though I didn't know about it as a child growing up. And I came from a non-Indigenous background, so I thought, this is work that Canada needs to tackle. I have skills as a journalist, I have insights to the residential school story, and I have a perspective that is to the broadest reaches of all of Canada, I should offer that. I'll offer those skills and see what happens.
In that excerpt that I had read earlier, you wrote that you were looking at 150 years of history all across this country. How did you know where to begin?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, you have to picture there was no guidebook for this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Indeed, there was no precedent for a national Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a so-called Western developed country. This was the first. It was the first in the world ever to be looking at harms that were specifically against children. And it was the first to look at harms that happened in the context of state-sponsored legal decisions, not in the context of military warfare,
right.
not in a short term, but over the time frame of more than a century. So your question is right, it was huge, and sort of where do we go? So one of the things that's really important for all Canadians to understand, remember if they once knew, but certainly not forget, is that this Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not a government-sponsored policy. It was an obligation put on the government and the churches by the courts as a result of a massive class action court case. And what that court case said is that, among other things, there will be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission so that those 80,000 at the time living survivors of those schools who are not going to have their day in court because it's an out-of-court settlement will have a forum where they can come forward and speak their truth of what their experiences were and provide the evidence of their own life experiences as children. And so they gave us signposts as to how to do that in our mandate. We didn't make up how are we going to go about this, and the mandate told us certain things that we had to do. And one of the things they told us we had to do is to hold and support an unspecified number of community events, but also very specifically 7 national events. It didn't say where, it didn't describe the nature of them, but it said 7 national events. So the first thing it's important to say is that we worked with a survivors advisory committee, and they were representative of all the regions of Canada in the broadest sense. There were, well, I won't repeat that, they were from all over the country. And so they didn't all have exactly the same residential school experiences, but they had all lived through residential schools. They were really vital in guiding us on things like, where will we hold these national events? Where would we have the greatest potential of drawing both survivors to attend, but also media to pay attention, non-Indigenous people to learn, for us to gather in a way that would be inclusive, but that would help us serve our core mandate job of educating the country and inspiring ongoing reconciliation. So once they told us where, that became kind of the map, the roadmap that we followed.
Well, I want to get a little better picture of the how, because not given much of a, you have a mandate, but not much of a blueprint. You're really kind of figuring this out as you go. 7,000 people over 6.5 years. That's a lot of stories. How did you manage that? Tell me a little bit about, maybe a particular event. How did that all come together?
Yeah. There's that old thing from a movie from a decade or so ago, but if you build it, they will come. We put a lot of attention into what will be the kinds of space that we create to convene gatherings. And one of the principles that we worked with is that we would, because Indigenous peoples are very diverse throughout Canada, not just are there First Nations and Inuit and Métis, but within each of those categories, great diversity. So one of our principles is that wherever we're going, we will work in advance with a cultural advisory committee to tell us the right way to conduct ourselves in that region, the right protocols, the right people to help us plan. So that was the first thing, is to make sure that we had community engagement and support, and that we were guided by them, not showing up and telling them, here's what we're going to do. The second thing is that we used protocols that were from that area to set a tone of respect and to do some of the work of honoring those things that our laws in Canada had not only tried to destroy, but had ruled illegal. A lot of spiritual ceremonies, drumming, potlatches, sweat lodges, things like that, that are spiritual traditions of Indigenous peoples. So we tried to do things in a way that said, let's work from what is still there, what has not been destroyed, and try to create an opportunity for educating the community itself and the younger generation, as well as wider members of the community who would come together. And then what we tried to do, because you say 7,000, that's a lot of people. What's really extraordinary is they all came voluntarily. Because the nature of our TRC, we had no incentive. There was no financial incentive. Other parts of the settlement agreement dealt with some money pieces, but not the TRC. Ours was really about educating the country, gathering and documenting and preserving for posterity, and then educating the country and inspiring reconciliation, as I've said. So we tried to create activities that would touch on each of those core areas of our work and plan around that, as if it was a big, think of it as a huge TV production, all the same ideas, who all needs to be there, when, who are our guests, what's the sequence, all of that.
You had mentioned your husband, Stephen, residential school survivor. I want to understand a little bit, how tricky was it to balance your role as a commissioner, but also a supportive partner of a survivor?
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll tell you is that before I ever became a commissioner, we had big conversations in our home about it, including whether or not he should be considered as one of the commissioners. And we talked about it and the pros and cons, and should we both apply? Will we cancel each other out? Should one apply? Should the other apply? And so on. And in the end, what he said to me is, he said, I think you should apply because I'm not sure I could bear it. That was his own self-assessment. And it's relevant to your question because he was fully supportive of me from the very beginning and remains fully supportive of me as I continue to talk about it. But it was challenging to be away from home, huge amounts of time. 75 to 90% of the time we were on the road somewhere or other. And I couldn't sort of call home and debrief the day the way you would, honey, I had a hell of a day at the office. You couldn't allow yourself to do that because I didn't know what I had heard and experienced would trigger him. So it was really, it was a difficult element of it, and at times really lonely for me.
I want to talk to you a little bit about your identity as a Canadian specifically. How did leading this commission affect your own identity? How did it challenge you? Did it change in terms of the way that you see yourself as a Canadian, how others see themselves as Canadians?
Yeah. I had, I would say, the benefit, the wealth of a big life before I ever did the commission. I had the incredible experience of studying in another country, of working in yet another country on another continent, being in cross-cultural such situations where everything about the system, the language, the faith traditions, the school systems, the people themselves were completely different from me. And that was always such an eye-opening and enriching experience for me. So I've, for a long time, already seen myself more of a citizen of the world than anything, because you see the wealth of all that's around us. In terms of how I saw Canada, though, what the experience did is it allowed me, because I know what our big reputation is in the world. I benefited from our big reputation in the world. Oh, Canada, it's everyone's desire to go. And so it should be. I'm not poo-pooing that. I'm just saying you bring, though, a more honest set of eyes to our country's history, and you realize, we have way more than just a brag sheet. We have also a list of not just huge failings, but really, really questionable practices that, even though we like to say we're not a colonial country, we have been a highly colonial country, and there has been damage done, and we're only just now looking in an honest mirror and seeing that about ourselves. And I saw it far more clearly and in ways that shook me, but made me realize, okay, what's my place in all that?
Well, I want to ask as well, you write that you are a woman of faith. How did you reconcile with the role of the church in residential schools?
Well, I am able to separate out faith and spiritual practice, and by the way, I'm not a person who's hunkered down to one tradition only. I've been invited into all kinds of faith expressions, both within this country and in other countries, and they have always been really rich experiences for me. I've treasured them, but I do understand the distinction between spiritual teachings and institutional behavior. There is a distinction, and I didn't think about that as a young person growing up. I didn't even understand church as an institution. I had no idea what the institutions, either our governments or our churches, were doing. And I try to be very honest about that in my descriptions of it in the early parts of the commission, because I grew up with all the same ignorance as everybody else did. But I'll tell you one story that I do talk about in the book, and it was one of the survivors actually that brought me some insight into that contradiction, that struggle, that inner struggle. And I remember them saying one day, this was a person who was very grounded in their traditional culture, embraced it, but they were also still a practicing Christian and gave the church a lot of credit for helping them with their healing. And they said, I don't hate the church. It's the people who did these things to us. And what they said was, what they did to us was so bad, it even turned God into a victim. And I thought, that's a sophisticated way of looking at it that takes you away from a place of hatred, and I want to hate everybody who's from this or that belief, to a place of, we have failed in measurable ways, and if we have to separate that from what we are supposed to be doing and how we are actually conducting ourselves.
We have less than a minute, and I have one more question to ask you. You and your fellow commissioners made 94 calls to action at the end of your commission. 9 years later, can you give us a progress report on how we're doing?
I cannot because I live in the far north still in Yellowknife, and I don't have a crystal ball to see what's happening all over the country. But I can tell you that I know of a lot of good things that are happening in pockets all over the country, and I am extremely impatient to see the creation of the National Council for Reconciliation as a mechanism that will be able to answer that question, so that we will all know, where are we getting better, where are we getting worse, what do we need to feel encouraged by, what do we really need to hunker down and put more attention and resource into. I long for that. But what I do know is this, with certainty, we are inching forward. It's all way too slow for me, but I know that there are a lot of good people. You're still talking to me about it 9 years later. I've been all over the country talking about it for these full 9 years. People have not stopped the conversation, and as long as people are still willing to learn and ask themselves, where do I fit into all of this? There's great hope, and lots of kids now, unlike when I was a child, are learning about this in school and are going to be differently informed citizens than my generation ever was. And I have great hope in that, starting with my own children and grandchildren.
I'm going to slip in one more question. I want to ask, on the day of National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, September 30th, established 3 years ago, do you think this helps move that needle that we're talking about on reconciliation, or does it allow people to be performative or complacent? Is there more that can be done with this day?
So I would say yes, and yes to that. It does help move the needle, and it can be performative, but
should it be a national day of service?
It definitely should be a national day of reverence and calling to attention and remembering, and not just remembering at the level of, oh yeah, my head, but deep remembering, and then from there saying, why is this important, and what do we need to do to make sure that the next generation of our children not having to constantly be apologizing for the way our governments of today have continued to act. I want, first of all, not just Indigenous people to show up for National Day. I don't want people just to wear an orange shirt and there that box is ticked. I want people to, I actually care less about whether or not people wear an orange shirt as to whether they do something that is in the spirit of reconciliation, that people intentionally gather together, not as one group, sort of observing the other, but as new communities forming, new communities of action that can work together to address fundamental and systemic issues in our country. And I really want to believe that we don't become rote about that. We don't slide back into the amnesia of the past. We don't allow ourselves to do that, for the soldiers and the veterans of this country. And I don't want us to do that for the children who struggled and suffered in schools, who did not choose to enlist for that, and some of whom never returned. I want to make sure that we keep the markers of that memory alive and that we keep the actions of a better way of expressing human rights in this country, because Indigenous rights are human rights, that we create a far better track record for ourselves on a daily going forward basis.
Mary Wilson, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the work that you do and joining us in studio today.
And I hope many people will read the book and maybe make it part of their annual reminder. It would be wonderful.
At home and within my community, we're just Indigenous, we're just Native. In school, usually people are expecting to see things that are very stereotypical. And what's very stereotypical is typically Plains Indians.
I do find that is quite often my experience as an Indigenous designer and maker, that you end up in spaces where you end up in an educational role in addition to the work that you're doing. My name is Britt Ellis. I'm also known as Blue Hummingbird. I'm a mixed Indigenous woman. I'm Haudenosaunee, Onondaga, and French and Irish. And I'm a beadwork artist, tattoo artist, multidisciplinary artist living in Toronto. I started beading in college at George Brown College at the Native Center that they have there. They had a drop-in beading group, so they would promote different activities every week to the student body. I took some materials home and I've been beading ever since.
My name is Sage Paul and I am Denisoothlanay. I call myself urban Indigenous, urban Denisoothlanay. I'm born and raised here in Toronto and I grew up in Gabriel Dumont, which is Native housing in Scarborough. I currently run the Indigenous Fashion Arts. It's a nonprofit organization that supports Indigenous fashion, Indigenous designers. Our big event is the Indigenous Fashion Arts Festival, which takes place every 2 years. Each year is over 100 artists that we're representing, so creating that space for our community to be able to celebrate our work.
Beadwork traditionally for Indigenous people has always been a form of communication, an identifier of your specific nation, that period of time. One of our elders, Oren Lyons, actually had said in the future, how will they know us? And they'll recognize us from our dress, so our specific styles and our beadwork. So that's always been the case, and I feel like especially when a majority of Indigenous people do live off reserve in urban centers, seeing another person with Indigenous style beadwork can instantly provide a little bit of calm, a little quick sense of community, a quick opportunity to connect. So it can also describe and portray our different stories. Our teachings generally, there's 13 moons in a year and each represents a different part of the year, part of the cycle. So incorporating those teachings as well into the phases of the moon pieces that I create. It's like a snapshot of a certain space and time, and it can communicate stories very specific to the owner, because with beadwork, I feel it's an incredible medium where you can translate just about anything. So it can be very individual to the person while still being a very clear visual cue to other Indigenous people.
When I went into the fashion industry and I volunteered at Toronto Fashion Week, which doesn't exist anymore. anyway, right? Like, so I tried to volunteered there, and it was very exclusive. It was very hard to get any kind of access to how I could participate in that space. So in 2016 is when I had just finished a big project with IKEA Canada, and it was really amazing to get to produce a collection, have that visibility. And after that project, I was like, okay, I want to create a fashion week. That's when I was like, I really want to do this. And I was so fortunate. One of my mentors and role models, Carrie Swanson, came up to me at a powwow. She said, Sage, what are you working on? And she knew I just had finished IKEA, and she'd been watching the work I was doing in fashion, so I guess she was inspired by it and excited at the idea of potentially working together. And she is a very high-level executive in Indigenous arts, so for her to approach me was a big deal. And I was like, but I want to do this fashion week thing. She's like, okay, let's do it. And so it just kind of went from there. Is like, okay, let's start. It started as a collective, an artist collective, just out of passion and need. And so in 2016 is when we really started getting the ball like rolling, thinking about what is this going to look like. And we had dozens of designers there who were presented. It was on the water, so getting to be by the water is just really meaningful. Water is such an important part of, water is life. And so it was really grounding for us as Indigenous people to get to launch the festival in a space that was so close to the land, because so much of, all fashion comes from the land. So I think it was a nice reminder to have that right there beside us.
Growing up outside of community, it was being around people that everyone looks very different, but we all see something familiar and in common with each other, and we've had similar experiences. So being able to share those and connect over those, and also being a person that was reconnecting at the time in my very early 20s, it was a really incredible conduit for that, and meeting different people that would help me along that journey of reconnection, building that confidence to do that. Her dramatic eyes, fool me once, but fool me twice. So just something super fun. It's lined with home tanned hide, and it's fully beaded all the way around. So sometimes I do incorporate traditional Haudenosaunee imagery, but that's not something that shows up in most of my work, because most of my work is more modern imagery. I do really enjoy pop culture as a whole, drag specifically, different music, so I do tend to work in those sorts of images, and again, sort of like putting them together in a traditional manner.
A lot of my work is spent assessing what the needs are of our communities. I can look at of course myself. So I'm always thinking, like, if I was, I'm in fashion and I want to be able to be a costume designer, what do I need access to? Who do I need access to? What kind of resources, finances do I need access to? And so then that just is about building relationships.
I think as an Indigenous person, and because of the way that I learned the techniques, the crafts, the stories, and the methodology behind it, those are the traditional aspects and pieces to it. There's other cultures that have beadwork, long histories of beadwork, and their processes and stories are all very different. In addition to using traditional materials whenever I can, and traditional ways of living, like cutting down, packaging, all those other things that are part of our traditional way of life. Indigenous cultural appropriation looks like a lot of things until relatively recently. Authentic and genuine representation of Indigenous people in film and media and print. It's something that folks can kind of look up on their own, but the history of Indigenous people in film and print is very sordid. There were not a lot of Indigenous people playing Indigenous characters, writing Indigenous roles, and things like that.
I would like to see Indigenous people profiting from our work so that we can be equal, players in the greater economic landscape that exists. I wish that we had the resources and the basic necessities that we need. So I think when those needs are met, is when we will stop having these conversations around cultural appropriation. Because when we have so little, next to nothing, the fact that other people are profiting off of us, when I have family members and we are just scraping by.
So sometimes it can be hard because some of the third-party individuals that are copying our designs can be not very transparent about it. But that's one thing that you can generally find in Indigenous designers is a great deal of transparency. Because of the 60s scoop, because of different governmental policies, there are a lot of us that are mixed, there are a lot of us that are diasporic on our own lands, and because of that, I personally, and I respect this in other artists that are very transparent about where they come from, about their process, about their families, and the process of making their art. That would be the best way to avoid appropriation, is to look for those specific things folks are talking about, we're open about it, and then wearing that work proudly and taking on also a bit of that educational piece on yourself, so that when folks admire your work, you can say, oh, actually this is such and such artist, this is their process and how they make this. Actually took 9 hours to make these, they're hand stitched, each bead is selected individually by hand, and the process with which we make them makes them an heirloom you can pass on.
It's so important to reframe the value of Indigenous made work. In colonialism, our work was stolen and then it's sold for much cheaper. Bill's Wild West, these kinds of old school ideas of what an Indian is, and really put on display. So it becomes a tourist activity as opposed to one that is cultural or expression. And that continues today. If you come to our fashion week, is where you see that the earrings that they're trying to copy are hundreds of dollars. But also, like, our idea around value, very different. We look at value in terms of the story that's connected with the work. We can look at the value in terms of where it comes from. Maybe there's ceremonial practices that are connected to a piece of a beadwork or an item of clothing. I was a French designer who ripped off this Inuit jacket. So it was this beautiful Inuit parka. And they got called out immediately because it was almost an exact replica of this family's parka. Of course, this story that is a part of that parka was not a part of this designer's narrative that they put in that collection. But when you go talk to that family, it comes from a really deep place of, there was a medicine man who had a dream or a premonition about this garment that was meant to protect its wearer. And it's completely different from just seeing it on the runway.
In times when I was growing up and felt not enough because I was mixed and because I was away from community, and as I've come back to community and reconnected, just really, really understanding that was the intent of the Canadian government. That was the intent, was to completely erase our cultures and our communities, to literally physically take us out of them and assimilate us into Canadian culture, and that every part of this reconnection is like a very political act on behalf of ancestors, future and past, for each of us.
Most of the designers I work with, Indigenous designers that I work with, their values are centered around teachings that we were raised with. Only take what you need. You can measure your wealth by how much you're able to give. And so that, that definitely changes the whole idea of like how we're making fashion. We're making fashion with materials that come from the land often. When we're not using materials that are coming like directly from our lands, like, fur or leather or woven textiles that are made from plant materials from this land. And so I think there's a lot more depth and meaning when it comes to Indigenous fashion than it does for commercial fashion. I think that including us in these conversations will help to fight appropriation, and I think it'll just make fashion better overall.
For Indigenous peoples, reconciliation is about restoring the relationships that make us Indigenous. It's an act of undoing settler colonial worlds.
Has Canada achieved reconciliation? I think that depends on who you're asking.
I think we've achieved frustration with the lack of action and the continuing gulf between rhetoric and reality.
Canada is very far from achieving reconciliation in really any way, shape, or form.
The Supreme Court of Canada views reconciliation as reconciling the assertion of Crown sovereignty over Indigenous lands with the reality that Indigenous peoples have always had a right to the land.
Fundamentally, then, it becomes trying to reconcile a right with a lie. The right is the interest in the land. The lie is that we'll find a way to circumvent recognizing it. Actually, we're not trying to reconcile. We're just trying to colonize in a more feel-good way.
In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, began sharing the story of residential schools in Canada.
The truth of residential schools in this country is a story about the resilience of children.
And Canada seemed very committed to the cause.
I give you my word that we will renew and respect that relationship.
But that's not exactly how things have played out. The TRC implemented 94 calls to action. These are actionable policy recommendations that have brought about real change, like the federal acknowledgement of Indigenous language rights, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, and the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But progress has been slow.
The first 42 of those calls deal with the legacy of Indian residential schools. They are the calls to action that, if implemented, would ease the burden and challenges that Indigenous peoples face in this country today. At this point, we are only at 13 of the 94 calls to action implemented, several of which were not actually implemented by the Canadian government and were implemented by church groups. Other calls to action that have been completed are more about managing Canada's public image rather than stopping the violence or the structural harms that Indigenous peoples are currently facing.
Reconciliation really is a first strong step towards decolonization, which is actually returning resources, returning land, returning governance authorities to Indigenous peoples. It is not about that dictionary definition of reconciliation, which is what I think the Canadian public often thinks about. Can't we all just get along? No, not when you're still holding all the stolen stuff, not when you're having racism in healthcare, racism in housing, extreme disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous people. There's a lot of disadvantage and violence that Indigenous people are still subject to in Canada.
The word reconcile implies that we are coming back to a relationship that was good in the first place. For many Indigenous peoples, there was never a good relationship with European settlers and the Canadian state to begin with.
The sort of Canadian power structure has taken on reconciliation begrudgingly as a sort of concession to Indigenous people, and it probably feels like a lesser concession than making real and substantive change. And I think they have to make this concession in some ways because Indigenous people are a relatively significant proportion of the Canadian population.
For Canadians, reconciliation is about interrogating the systems of oppression that enable your presence as Canadians. So that looks like interrogating white supremacy, capitalism, settler colonialism, invasion, oppressive structures, patriarchy, all of these ways that Canada was able to create a foothold in these lands needs to be reckoned with.
Very few things are changing on the ground for Indigenous people. Indigenous land defenders are still forced to be there on the front lines, defending their land against militarized police forces.
They said sovereign would do it in land!
There's the kind of surface reconciliation that's like, we said our land acknowledgement, we've included you in the room, you're here. And then there's people who are really committed to what would it look like if we lived under the laws of Indigenous peoples in this territory? Or what would it look like if I paid my taxes to the nation whose territory I'm on. That's a different kind of reconciliation, I think, that's not actually in the broader discourse, right?
I think what stands in the way of real reconciliation is a lack of political will. Indigenous people for decades have been told, we'd love to help you solve all these problems. You have a boiled water advisory, love to help you out, but sorry, we don't have the money.
Reconciliation itself gets framed as an individual endeavor, and it's not. It is a systemic change. It is a public shift toward respecting Indigenous nationhood and our presence, our laws, our languages, and who we are as pre-existing nations. It's entirely possible to respect the work of the survivors and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and respect where we're at so far in Canada when it comes to reconciliation. It's also okay to say that it doesn't stop there.
You're not simply going to say, okay, the past is the past, we're sorry, and keep all the spoils and then keep all the governance authority and think that you've achieved reconciliation. That's just not the case, and Indigenous people are not fooled.
Those are Indigenous lands. Indigenous laws exist. Recognize that. If reconciliation is making you feel good, you're doing it wrong.
And that is the agenda for Monday, September 30th, 2024. A couple of quick program notes before we go. TVO presents the documentary Red Fever, which follows Cree co-director Neil Diamond on his journey to explore the world's interest in Indigenous culture, from fashion shows to sports and everything in between. You can catch Red Fever on TVO on Saturday, October 5th at 9 p.m. or anytime at youtube.com/TVO. And tomorrow on this program, COVID-19 is still with us, but just how worried should we still be more than 4 years later? We'll find out. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.